how you could be was tightly controlled. And so growing up there, I grew up with this profound contradiction that I was trying to make sense of. How can a place be so intensely Christian? I mean, intensely Christian and intensely racist at the same time. How can a place be so committed to orthodoxy and yet so ethnically strident and divided? And I could not get my mind around it. So Grand Rapids was a Dutch enclave, but there were also Polish people and Italians and Irish, and they did not like each other at all. But they all went to church. And I was like, okay. I used to ask the people, in my church growing up, and then when I found myself to Calvin College, I would kind of ask my professors why this was the case, and none of them could figure it out. And so that was my journey, trying to figure out how these two things can be so tightly woven together. And it, of course, it led me on into college, but it led me on to graduate school, and I continued to have those questions.
Did you have a point ever of rebellion against the faith because of those contradictions?
Well, here's the thing about it. If you ask people, in my church, I was always against the faith. My poor pastor, he was a lovely man. I grew up in a Baptist church, and the pastor was. But I was one of those precocious kids that in Bible study I would raise my hand, and he would look around. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions? Yes, Brother Jennings. What's your question? And I would always say, I'm young. I was not trying to be devilish. I was just trying to say, well, Reverend, what you just said doesn't make any sense. Or I would say, okay, what you just said contradicted what you said last week. Then I would ask these questions. Okay, so it seems to be like there's two accounts in Genesis. Is that correct? And he had such a hard time with me. I'll never forget one day he pulled my mother to the side and he said, Mrs. Jennings, I hate to tell you, but your boy's not saved. And my mother said, Reverend, I think he's going to be okay.
Good
But I was always that kid who asked those questions and could not be satisfied with those Christian answers. And and my mother and my father were serious readers. Obviously, in those days, being able to go on to school was not a possibility. But they were serious readers. And my dad was the kind of person. He was he would have been a perfect professor because he had a kitchen table philosophy, which meant that whoever was around, he brought him to the kitchen table to talk. So, all the various denominations, the Nation of Islam guys, the Jehovah's Witness guys and women, the Pentecostals who were going around town, he would bring them all to the kitchen table, and they'd be sitting around talking, not only to him, but to each other, and they started arguing. My dad would just enjoy it. Say, oh, look at this. And he used to love to have the folk who would come door to door, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he would bring them to the table. He would just start asking them questions, and then after a while, they said, okay, sir, thanks. We're going to leave. He wasn't argumentative. Mm-hmm. He was just not satisfied with those pat answers. And I'm like,
sounds like you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you find your way through that? Since you didn't seem to rebel against Christianity, but you asked your questions, how did you navigate through that without the church rebelling against you, as it were?
That's a great question. The church did. I did not. When I told my family and my pastor that I sensed a call to ministry, there was no cheering. There was no cheering. In fact, I did not preach my initial sermon as a Baptist. This is standard fare. I did not preach my initial sermon in my Baptist church. My pastor would not let that happen because he didn't think I was saved. So call. I preached my initial sermon at Calvin College, what was then Calvin College, during a chapel service. Yeah. And the first, and I talk about this in my Christian imagination, the first people to ever shake my hand and honor me as a young minister with my white Dutch professors at Calvin. And so that messed me up. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But I never, the fact that I questioned so much, but yet stayed so faithful did not make sense to them. And so, I was never a part of the traditional formation of a Baptist minister. And looking back on it, I'm quite happy about that.
Yeah.
Because I realized there's a sense in which, with all our communities, there's a point at which we have to remind ourselves and remind them that there is a foreignness, an undomesticated reality to being Christian that no people who call themselves Christian can control. That there is something about being Christian that makes us, because we are Christian, traitors to our own people. Because we are a different people drawn together. And so even in a church, there is something that should be a little uneasy about being Christian, because we belong to each other, but together we belong to God. And that reality of belonging to God, it pulls us, in a sense, in a different direction than we're often comfortable with.
We'll unpack that, I hope, in a minute or two. But I'm curious about your pastor not thinking you were saved. So, so are you? No.
Last I checked. But you never know.
How would you describe your faith journey in those early years? Was there a conversion point? Do you think there was, you grew into it? I mean, many of us came to faith very young, and more grew into it than anything else.
Well, I think growing into it is accurate, but I also think, for me, it's the slow realization that even if you are questioning, even if you are at times not believing, you are always in conversation with God. And I think what struck me, at a point in my life, I realized that it didn't matter whether on any particular day I was questioning what sermon was preached or what I had read. God was with me. And I was in conversation with God. And so it was the inescapable reality that I'm always with the Lord. And so, it wasn't a question of giving my heart. My heart was already in God's hands. And so, in a sense, I came to recognize that I am a Christian. Now, but the reality of it is that meant, I think in a fundamental way, it wasn't always obvious to those talking with me. And it's supposed to be that way. It shouldn't always be obvious. Because what I'm showing really is my humanity before God. And so there's something really good about keeping people guessing.
I'm thinking about young people today, many of whom are full of questions, and the questions are often rejected outright. And they're not able to find their way, perhaps, within a church community that is not welcoming of that, particularly as we increasingly in a polarized situation. So I just wonder if you have any advice based from your experience on those young people who they're questioning, and I know I love the questions, but they're told they don't have faith if they're asking questions. So, I mean, is there something you would say to to those people. And they're not only young people either. Some of us are old people, just, still asking questions. So, and we learn how to maybe not be as vocal in expressing those questions, or we know where to ask the questions as you get older, I guess.
Yeah. The 20-somethings and 30-somethings have it really difficult today. I think primarily because the Christianity that they have been watching doesn't seem to be aligned with reality in the ways it should be. And so, like, I have a 26-year-old and a 26-year-old and a 31-year-old. They're both Christian, but they could not be raised in the church I was raised in because they wouldn't stand for it. It's just, the way in which that church, its blind spots for them are so massive. They're not going to pretend that they see what they don't see. Yeah. And I think the challenge for us is to meet 20-somethings and 30-somethings honestly where they are, honestly, and try our best not to get them to conform to what we think they ought to be. This is really difficult for Christianity, especially in the Western world, because the Christianity all of us, I dare say all of us, were shaped in is a Christianity still tightly bound to a certain desire to control behavior and to control thought rather than cultivate thought. And so for 20-somethings and 30-somethings, that's really, really difficult to stomach because they can smell through, they can see that difference between you wanting to engage me or you wanting to engage me in order to control me. And that's the difficulty because many of us aren't smooth enough to hide the fact that we want to control them. And so it slips out pretty quickly. Okay, I was waiting for this. It took about 10 minutes for you to get to. So the challenge is to engage the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings at the place of their questions and at the place of our own questions and engage them with this one fundamental goal. I want life with you. And I trust the Holy Spirit to speak to you in ways that means I don't have to convince you. I trust the Spirit. But part of the Christianity that we've inherited never really trusted the Spirit. It trusts control. And so a lot of our discursive practice, the way we talk, is angled at manipulation. And we try, many of us who know better still have to be careful because one of the dangers of being orthodox is to think of orthodoxy inside of control and instead of inside of a way of life. A way of life can be presented as control, but if it's presented as a way of life, what should come out is an invitation to listen as I'm trying to listen to the Spirit. And my trusting that the Spirit is talking to you. And to allow that empty space between my listening and your listening. And if your life is not lining up in the way my life has lined up, I can relax and in a sense, give you and me time to find our life together. But that is so difficult because we weren't raised in anything like that. What I just described, there was not one church I grew up in all those churches in Grand Rapids that had anything like that happening. Yeah. But for our 20-somethings and 30-somethings, this is really crucial. I meet kids all the time. They're deeply, and I call them kids, but please forgive, I don't mean infantilize them. But I meet folk all the time. They're deeply committed to environmental change. They want a form of spiritual life that takes seriously life on the ground. They want a completely different way than Christians tend to talk about the body. and Christian obsession with regulation of the body. It's like, okay, you folks, I mean, this is you just are unbelievably obsessed with regulation of the body. And so they want a different way of thinking about that. They want a different way of thinking about money and politics. And we've got to meet them there. But as you know, these are not things that come easy for Christians to talk about or think through.
No, and I wonder if that, I mean, when we look at the rapid decline of the church in the West, you know, it's part of it has to be because it's been a colonizing church, which is, you know, lets everybody look the same and we tick the boxes and so on and so forth. That's how we admit you. That's how we know you're saved. Those kinds of things. And so, I mean, the transition to that, is it possible to transition to that? Or are we looking at the age of a church where one thing has to die before another thing can emerge?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're all in the midst of it. As I watch it, there is, you know, what's existing is becoming the seed for something else. So it's crumbling into the ground, and something else is emerging. But what's emerging is really interesting because, as I said, I meet people all the time. They come to seminary, come to divinity school where I am, and they'll come to my office. I was telling Danny this the other day. They come to my office and they'll say, "I don't have anything to do with the church. I don't want to be a minister." I said, "Well, why are you tell me why you've come to divinity school." "Well, I really love people and I really care for people. And I want to be with people in their pain. And I want to help them get the most out of their spiritual life. And I want to be able to sit with them over sacred texts. And I want to gather people together to do that." That sounds a lot like a minister to me. Sounds a lot like, no, I don't want to be a minister. Okay, but that sounds a lot, I'm just saying that sounds a lot like a minister to me. And then what I always wind up saying to them at the end of the conversation, at some point in the conversation, I will say to them, I think one of the problems that we're talking through now is that when you think church, when you think Christianity, when you think Christian identity, you are thinking about something back there. But you're not thinking about something up there. And what I always, especially the ones who I sense a call to ministry, which many of them have, said, well, you know, I believe God is preparing you for a group of people that are not there, but are up ahead. You're not being prepared to be my spiritual leader, my pastor. You're being prepared for a group of people you cannot see right now. But I can see them over the tip of that hill. And if you will trust the process, if you will trust this formation, by the time you get to the tip of that hill, you will see them. And guess what? They will look just like you in a sense. That is, they will have the same kinds of questions, same kind of dislike, but they will want what you want right now. And that really is where we are. The church and Christian identity is being reborn, it's being reconstituted all around us. The problem for the main line, both the church and theological education, is that we've tied our educational endeavor to a particular kind of financial model. That financial model has crumbled because we don't have the kind of resources and people are not tithing like they used to keep these wonderful institutions. But God is still calling people. And there are still people who want God. And so they are finding their way to different places to be educated, finding their way to different places to gather. And I think on the other side, it'll be very different, but it will be easily identifiable as church and as Christian and as Christian leader. Now, of course, as we know, the challenge is not to spend all our time mourning to death and not to spend our time trying to resurrect dead bodies, especially without the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
Get up, get up. No, they're not getting up, man. So we have to stop trying to resurrect old visions of ministry, old visions of Christian identity, old visions of pastoral leadership, and old visions of church. So before the pandemic, my wife and I, we were attending this church. We had, we just moved to a new area. We were attending this church, wonderful church, in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Pastor Anthony Bennett there at this church, Mount Airy. And the first Sunday we came, now this is a kind of quasi-Baptist / Pentecostal / charismatic / have a good time, wonderful, deeply committed to the community kind of church. So we were like, yes. So we came in, and the first thing that happens after they greet you and say, good morning, welcome you in the name of the Lord, then they say, I'm a stay. You all know what that means, right? So they say, I'm a stay, which I see I see the God in you. It's part of Buddhism. And they start the service with like 3 minutes of meditation. 3 minutes. Your face is what? They start the service with 3 minutes of meditation. Yeah. So they have you come and center. They'll play soft music and they center and people come in, and then it's praise and worship. And the church is packed, right? Now, that's not a Baptist church like most people know a Baptist church, but that's a Baptist church. So we're not going back to that. We're going back to what we used to be. We're going for some of your faces. Can we have a camera just spare? What? But I think what we are in the middle of is watching. We quote that passage all the time, and we never mean it, which says, "I am doing a new thing."
Yeah.
I'm doing a new thing. We quote it, but we never mean it. Because if there's a new thing, we're like, we don't like this new thing. I'm doing a new thing. God says, I'm doing a new thing. It's too new, God.
Yeah, I mean, people, I think sometimes we figure, well, we've just figured Jesus out, so,
That is exactly right. That is exactly right.
But, that we don't, the willingness to admit that we don't figure Jesus out, I think, and is so key. And yet Jesus is the reality that confronts us every morning. And that I find that fascinating. Yes. I think that's why people still are they feel the call. They meet Jesus somewhere, and they know Jesus is asking something of them. And so they come forward. And so what you've just said about theological education resonates with us here at ADC, because part of our Lilly Foundation has given a lot of money to seminaries of late to look at different projects for future ministry. And we're trying to do some work so we can peek a little farther over the hill that you talked about. Mm-hmm. The challenge then is, if you can peek over the hill and see what it might be like, we don't train the same way that we would for what's past. So I just wonder if you have any inklings about, it's hard to imagine, and yet then it's even harder to imagine how we need to equip and prepare people to serve as leaders in that context. Yeah. But yet that has to be what we're about, because I'm concerned that if we don't figure that out, we'll just keep producing leaders for a church that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, this is as they say, this is a global problem. I think at the heart of it for all of us is we have to rethink and think very slowly and carefully about what Christian formation is. What are we forming people toward? And the answers on the table are not good. So we have got to rework that. What is a Christian to look like that doesn't look like Billy Graham? Mm-hmm. Because there are many schools, when they think of the idea of Christian, they think of Billy Graham. That is a horrible mistake. And there are people probably listening who think what I just said is anathema. because Billy Graham is the perfect Christian. No, he ain't. And so we have to rethink exactly what Christian life looks like. This is the hard work. When I go to schools and talk about this, I'll ask schools, okay, as we're looking at your curriculum and what you're doing, I want you as faculty and staff to close your eyes, and I want you to envision what the perfect graduate, not perfect in terms of everything, but this person who's graduating, they look exactly like what we want our graduates to look like. And it is often very depressing what they will describe. But then when I get them to start to talk about students who have graduated that approximate that, now we can start to have a conversation. Okay, it's not one student, it's this capacity that this student had, this ability this student showed, this characteristic that this student showed. If I start to put them together, I start to get a sense of what we're trying to do. And that starts to really blow the handles off the door, because people realize that what they're teaching in their classes, what the curriculum looks like, everything they're doing in their common life is really not geared toward that. It's geared toward Billy Graham. With a little more theology. I hope I'm not offending anybody by that, though. And if I am, so sorry. But this is the problem we face. There's a point at which we have to remember that Jesus called disciples, many of whom did not really like each other, many of whom no one else would have chosen. And one of them was a betrayer. But he called these people. These are not the people we would have selected, right? And so we can't domesticate what God does. But we have to figure out how to do the formation work inside the wildness of God and who God was. I mean, my classroom was obviously different from your classroom, but the range of people in my classroom is just amazing. But one of the things that holds them together, anybody who comes to theological education has chosen the less appealing path. They have chosen to go the crooked way, because they know they're not going to make a lot of money. They know, if for many of them, they're choosing against family. But they've come. And so even though there's this wide variety, there's something that's holding them together, and it's God.
I wonder about then the future of theological education. And
Glorious.
is it glorious? Is it only glorious because that's our future, or
glorious?
And I'm thinking too about just the potential wideness and access to theological education. If access were widened, would we find, different outcomes? And also then, how do we begin to transition from the kinds of curricula that have been on offer towards a different thing and still equip people for a whole wide range? Some will have to go into what are still traditional churches and will want that, and others will be wanting the new thing. How do we encourage them in that? Because they're probably not going to find a paid role to do that, and they have to pay off their tuition. So,
you're asking the hardest question that we're facing. So I always say to my students and my colleagues that we're inviting people to basically live the life of an artist. That's what we're inviting people, and we're inviting people. If you are a painter or if you play the guitar, you're going from gig to gig. You might have a tent making job somewhere, but you're committed to your art. And so, as artists know, when you ask them, why are you doing this? The answer is, I have to do this. And as I say to students coming, if there's other things you can do, see you. Because this is the art. You're here because this is the art. The good thing that's happened to theological education, and it has been cut off from social status climbing. You know, it used to be you come here because you want to wind up in First Church, and First Church is going to make you rich and famous and put you on TV and the radio and newspaper.
That was never an aspiration of folks in Atlantic Canada, I don't think. But okay.
Okay.
A localized version of that.
Localized version. The local newspaper.
Right.
Radio station. But, you know, that whole thing is gone. And what remains is, are you committed to the art? Yeah. And because you're committed to the art, you will do it. You do it anywhere, right? It is that woman, you know, downtown with her violin case open, her little dog next to her, and she's just playing her heart out, and she sounds fantastic. And you know, and people are dropping in a few dollars, and then some smart producer comes by and say, "Oh, you got a great sound. Let's bring you to the studio," and she gets discovered, but no one was there when it was raining outside, and she was still working that beautiful song. That's basically what we're saying to people in theological education. You know, you're basically going to have your guitar case open. You'll be standing out there. Hopefully it won't rain. You little dog, and you're going to play your heart out. And hopefully some people will stop and hear you, and many will not. Now, for some people, that is unbelievably unattractive. But for other people, they're like, cool. That's what I'm about.
It's scary yet compelling.
There is nothing about following the call that is safe. There is nothing about theological education that should ever tell people they're going to be safe. This is always the illusion that we give, that coming here, you're coming to safety. You are not. You're coming to the place, you're coming to the education that's going to put you not simply in harm's way, but it's going to put you right where harm is trying to be generated for you to say no. That's what you come to when you're in theological education. And, you know, quite frankly, the 20-somethings and 30-somethings I encounter, if you say that to them, they'll say, good, that's why I'm doing this and not going to law school. That's why I'm doing this and not getting my MBA, because of what you just said. And we just have to be honest about it. Now, of course, what you just said is correct in terms of, the money picture and the financial modeling. I meet students who come with debt. They're going to take on more debt, and I don't want them to. And so I'm doing everything I can to find the money so that nobody has to pay a penny when they come to theological education, start to finish. And to try to find people who, if they come and then they say they're going to work into a small rural church, somebody with money will pay off all their student loans and let them do that. I mean, that's the goal.
That's a good goal.
That's the goal. But in the meantime, if I meet someone who clearly, as the old folks could say, I could see God all over her, I'm going to tell them, God is all over you. Even if you don't believe in God, God is all over you. And welcome, we're glad you're here. And my hope is by the time you're finished, the God who is all over you, you will know is also in you. And sometimes it happens, and sometimes they still leave not quite sure what just happened to them.
I'm going to pause for a minute, make sure there's no questions in the room, because I'm very happy to carry on this conversation. But there is, Danny, right over here.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. I'm listening to you speak about inspiring theological students, and I have this negative voice going, yeah, but yeah, but, and I'm trying not to, but I do. Because if God is preparing them for a group of people who they have not yet met, they still have a congregation full of Billy Grahams. And those are their donors, those are their people, those are the people they're caring for. And in the work that I do as a priest, but also in other areas and in my research, that's what causes the most harm, frankly, to a lot of clergy, is trying to balance those things, because it is easier on the body and the mind sometimes. It's easier on the body to listen to the congregation, but that's only going to sustain you so long if you don't have the time and attention. So I just wonder, how realistically are we preparing students and young clergy for that reality until we are over the hill?
That's a great question, because it is the case, especially with the grain of the church, and I don't want to sound ageist as I say this, so I'll be careful, but especially with the grain of the church, that clergy, young clergy or new clergy stepping into those settings are often sitting and talking with people who, to use the old folks' language, they are deeply set in their ways. And they're trying to present the way of Jesus, often in a new way. And so your question, how do we prepare them for that? Other than saying that that's what you're going to face, there almost really is no preparation for that. Other than this one, and I'll tell it in terms of a story. For many years I was at a Methodist institution where students who graduated were placed in 2-point or 3-point charges in small, low rural places, often populated by small groups of seniors. And they would come as the pastor, and the very first question that they would be asked implicitly and sometimes explicitly by the congregation, wherever they were going, is this question: can I trust you with my life as it is right now? Can I trust you? And for many of these seniors, life as it was right then was that they were newly widowed. They had been diagnosed with the same thing that took their partner. Their kids or grandkids were not really caring for them, and they were alone. And what they wanted to know from this new young upstart in front of them is, can I trust you to hold my life right now? And at their best, our graduates will give the answer, you can trust me with your life right now. But I have a question for you. Can I trust you with my life right now? And the crucial struggle was for them to have the courage to ask that question while they were answering the question that was asked of them in the affirmative. Now, in the best cases, where we had victory, that congregation would say, yes, you can trust us. Now, what does that translate into? Listen to what I'm preaching. Listen to what I'm teaching. Listen to what I'm trying to say week in and week out. Listen to me. As I'm coming to the hospital to see you, as I am sitting beside you, hear me because I am holding you. You hold me. And so the work of discipleship, not for the minister, but for the congregation, was to hold that minister's life. And to hold that minister's life is first and foremost to listen to her. And where it always went badly is when she would say, I am holding you. But the church, those 10, 15, 20 people, would say, we're not holding you. And in those cases, I would always say, tell your district superintendent it's time to go. Because it's not a question of you caring for them. It's a question of them caring for the gospel even at this point in their life. Being sick and suffering and mourning does not excuse you from holding to the gospel, because we are in this together. So your holding to the gospel doesn't mean that you have to do what the minister's doing. It means that if God is speaking to you through her, your deepest work of discipleship, dear mourning widow, your greatest responsibility, dear suffering saint, just listen to her. Listen to her. Some do, and some don't. So what I want to prepare students to have the courage to have both those responses. I'm going to hold you, even though you say things that are really, really inappropriate. But I'm going to hold you. But you're going to listen to me.
That can be tricky in a Baptist church. There's no district superintendent to move you anywhere.
Yeah, you're stuck at that point, aren't you?
Yeah. We have another question. Dr. Stuart Blythe.
Thank you. I'm enjoying listening to this so much. The call to the artist, I think, is a fascinating one. To go back to church, since, as you were indicating there, that's part of the situation. It's not simply people are called to ministry, they're called to churches. Churches are full of people. In Baptist ecclesiology, we tend to use this language sometimes, that the church is a gathered community of believers, and we then fill that term with what we mean by community and what we think of believer. But in your book, After Whiteness, you introduce, and with a beautiful poem, if I might say, the concept of the crowd. Should that be our ecclesiology? That we are, so tell me about the crowd.
That's a great question. So in my book, After Whiteness, I talk about that the fun, in some ways, it gives like what we were talking about earlier, the fundamental ability that we should cultivate in theology education is to cultivate people who have the ability, who gain the ability to gather a crowd. Because that's what Jesus did. He gathered a crowd. Now, friends, the crowd is not Christian. It's on its way to becoming Christian. As I say, crowd is on its way to becoming congregation. But crowd is always in congregation. And the crowd is made up of people, many of whom are not nice. Many of whom don't like each other. Many of whom, if you turned your back, they'd stab each other really quickly and then say, I didn't do that. Next hymn. And so Jesus gathers a crowd, and he draws that crowd into a fundamental decision. And it's this: if you will come to me and gain from me, you must be with each other. That's the deal. You have to be with each other. And if crowd starts to become congregation. They start to come to care for each other. Now, this is no minor thing, because these people are enemies. As I like to tell my students all the time, in the Bible, there is something really important about enemies. You have to name enemies, because if you don't name enemies, you don't know who you're supposed to love. So you have to name enemies. So these folks are enemies, and they are drawn together by this Jesus. And so what we want are for our wonderful students when they graduate to be able to draw together people who would not, under any other reason other than it's you, be talking to each other. You know when you're with a saint who has shown that beautiful skill, when they pass on and there's the funeral, and then the funeral, people come to the funeral like, how did you know? How did you know? Yeah, well, he was, oh, really? So people who you would not think would know each other, and they certainly wouldn't be in this room had it not been for that person in that box, because they drew people together. And of course, the point being, this is what church, this is what a healthy ecclesiology is. It is an untamed thing. It is not a homogeneous thing. It is not a thing that everybody looks alike, talks alike, sounds alike. There are people here that are really not like one another. But they're here because what's going on in here has brought them together. And that's what we need. The difficulty is that, as you were asking earlier, what curricula is set up to do anything like that? And, I've been, as I say, I'm like Johnny Cash, I've been everywhere, man. And there is not a place I know, this country, Australia, South Africa, the UK, there's not a place I know where theology education is set up to do that. Because it takes a different kind of commitment to the crowd than we have yet shown. I mean, you have to remember, the disciples, this is often the thing when we read the Gospels, the disciples are never really happy about what Jesus is doing. I mean, they're like, okay, where are we going now? Okay, you see all these people around? The one, would you send her away? I mean, when are we going to get back to our people? What's going on here? So there is that uncontrollability to what Jesus is doing that we just have never been able to be comfortable with, and we are always, in the South, in the U.S. South, they have this, there's this saying that people are always looking for their color, kin, and kind. Color, kin, and kind. And that has been the dominant modality of the church, to always look for its color, kin, and kind. And God ain't never worked that way. God ain't never been about you getting with your color, kin, and kind. Your color, kin, and kind are always smashed up and broken up and woven to. God has always been a quilter. Pieces from everything. And we have such a hard time with God, the quilter. It'd be better if God just worked with, just had blankets that are all the same color, same size. But God don't do that. All right, I'm fussing now. So
No, that's great. It really is. And that was actually the point that I had hoped we would end on, was talking about reconciliation. How does Jesus bring, that crowd together, and so that we can move forward together? And I would like to think that as a school, I'm looking at my colleagues, I'm thinking as a school, we want to take on that challenge that you just set out there. And I'm sure we'll have massive failures along the way, but we're praying for a success here and there that will enable us to. We want to prepare people for this work that God's calling them to. We don't want to just uphold structures for the sake of it, because I like to think that we're the artists out there on the street too, to some degree. And I see all my colleagues nodding, so that's a good thing.
You know, can I just say
yeah, go ahead.
about that very thing? I mean, one of the most difficult things for us to realize when it comes to this is that it's often been said especially in recent decades, about how deeply political just being church should be. And I'm so committed to that truth. And what's at the heart of that truth are gathering people together who, because of their very makeup, they demand a change in the social and economic fabric of a society. So if you have a community that's gathered with a wide variety of people who feel the full effects of bad government policy, bad real estate policy, bad economic policy, because they are there together, that church is going to be very clear on what needs to be done in a society. But when you have homogeneous units, as we used to say back in the day, when you have churches that are just color, kin, and kind, the blindness of a church becomes so pronounced because there's nobody in that church who feels the blows of what governmental or economic or real estate policies are in existence all around us. And so a church that is filled with the tapestry of the many, a church that is a woven quilt, that church by its very nature will know what's going on. You don't have to have people come in and say, did you know that these folks were kicked out of their home? Did you know that this horrible business practice happened? Did you know? Because in that church, they will know. And in that church, and here's something else happened. In that church, there's no politician, no business person, there's nobody who could walk in and deceive them because they are all there. And they will say, no, you're lying. And the reason we're lying is because sister told me what you did over in that community. Because she's there, but she's also here. And so that's the fundamental. So we need to create, we need to cultivate, we need to form those disciples who understand the deep political implications of drawing together the crowd. You don't need somebody from on high saying what ought to happen in the community when you have the community together in worship. They know what needs to happen. And the only question is, will they be heard?
We're going to leave that as the last word together. Our time is up, sadly. But I want to thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, for just sharing from your heart and from life and with such authenticity. It's been an absolute joy, and I'm sure that it's been the same for others around. So
thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to those online. Thank you.